Well, hello. Welcome to Simple Worship Conversation, also known as the morning program with Shannon Moore.
Oh, I didn't know that was a part of
Oh,
it
yeah,
too.
that's part of the title.
I'm
and
excited
I am
to
Shannon
be
Moore.
here because aren't you about to go into syndication?
I don't know. We can't talk about that yet. This is Renee Hoke, always a great conversation partner. So, for the past several weeks, I have given the guest the opportunity to choose the text that we look at. And so for the third week in a row, we're in the Old Testament,
Yay.
which tells me we're kind of hungry for Old Testament stories. They were always my favorite
Great stories.
when I was a kid. Sometimes kind of scary.
Great characters,
but
great plot lines.
Exciting, interesting. And so today we're going to be in 1 Samuel, the third chapter. We probably should set up a little bit what happens before this.
Please.
There's a woman named Hannah who desperately wants to give birth to a child and prays desperately for that and promises the child to God if she gets to have it. And so there's a priest named Eli. She has the child, and she basically gives the child to Eli. Eli has some sons of his own who aren't very good men. As a matter of fact,
worthless.
My Bible says they were scoundrels.
Oh, that's probably high praise for those two.
Yeah. And so that's going on. Eli had high hopes for them to follow in his footsteps as a priest. And God is not happy with those boys. And so this young boy, Samuel, Hannah's daughter, lives with Eli in the temple. And so we're going to hear a little bit about what happened to him. So you know the drill. You've been on the program many times.
I have. 10 minutes.
That's right. I'll read the scripture and then we'll talk about it for 10 minutes.
All right. Let's do it.
And that's because Simple Worship is short service when we're together. So, all right. So here we go. 1 Samuel chapter 3. I'm going to read the first 10 verses and then we'll talk about it. Now, the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his room. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel." And he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli, and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." All right, well, let's get our timer going. And tell me, Renee, why you wanted to talk about this scripture today.
I love the story. I love the way it speaks to how we listen for God and how God's voice could sound very much like another voice in our life, a voice that we hear every day, and how it is, of course, for Samuel, a small boy, how it is that we learn to listen. Eli helped Samuel listen, even though Eli must have had a hunch that if God was talking now to Samuel instead of Eli, Eli was on his way out. Don't you think he must have understood that?
Well, yes, because, God had spoken to Eli before and told him how unhappy.
And asked him to do something about his sons. Eli, we can see in these verses, spoke to his sons. But there wasn't any tough love.
Right.
And they didn't change.
And don't you think that Eli, even so, would be expecting if God was going to speak to anybody, it would be to him.
Of course.
And so that's why he keeps sending Samuel back.
Very similar to when God stopped speaking to King Saul and began to speak to David. Very similar kind of, all right, your time is past. And normally there's some baggage that goes along with that. But Eli, even though he must be suspicious that he's not in God's favor anymore, still helps Samuel understand when God calls your name, you open yourself, you say, speak because your servant is listening. I love that phrase. And so he was a spiritual director in a lot of ways, I'm sure, to Samuel, helping Samuel listen, which makes me think of the path that you're on, being trained as a spiritual director. And
Right.
your training will allow other people to listen for God's voice.
Because in that, it's not I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor, I'm none of that. It's just a companion on a journey, on a spiritual journey. And so helping people just like this, guiding people to be more open to what God is saying. And Samuel had, I think, some obstacles in his path in that the word of the Lord was rare. Visions were not widespread. So he wouldn't have heard of this sort of thing
Right,
happening before. He was also very young. And so it said that he didn't yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. What do you think that means?
I just wonder if it's an age of reason. In our evangelical past, we talk about this point of time where you can accept a call to become a Christian, participate in baptism, this maturity that comes to your life, enough of maturity to understand yourself over against God, who God is, where God speaks to us in other ways. And so he was just coming into his own kind of faith formation. And I'm sure all of it had come. He had a very faithful mother, Hannah, but she had surrendered him early to the temple. So he had Eli teaching him and probably never imagining that at such an early time in Samuel's life, God was going to be using him as an instrument for something God was about to do.
And do you wonder how long would this have gone on had it not been for Eli's help and guidance of what to say? Would God have continued to call Samuel?
That's a good question.
Or is it necessary for somebody to teach us how to answer these calls and how to open ourselves to God? Might he have missed this opportunity to hear what God was saying had it not been for Eli's guidance?
I've talked with lots of people who have had a season where God was tapping them on the shoulder, nudging them. They weren't ready to stop and listen. Then the tapping and the nudging went away for a while. Most of the time it came back again, but we need to be prepared to listen. We need to have that spiritual antenna up so that we don't miss the opportunity to participate in what God is doing in the world.
Years ago, maybe close to 10 years ago, I was in an antique store and I heard my name whispered, Shannon, that clearly. And I turned around to see who was whispering to me, and there was nobody there. And I took off. I left. I have always wondered what, if anything would have happened if I had answered that whisper, if I had said yes or responded
Speak,
in any
Lord,
way.
your servant is listening.
Yeah. I'm not saying that it was God whispering to me, but what if it was?
God could speak to people in an antique store.
Yeah, maybe so. And I ran. I don't know.
Happen.
It freaked me out.
Because I knew this story well. When I was in high school, I was in a small town, didn't have too many organists. And so every other week I was the organist, either for the Baptist church or the Episcopal church. And when I would practice at the Episcopal church, I would practice and the sun would go down and I'd be so absorbed because it was a wonderful pipe organ that I'd lose track of time and I would have to flip the light off behind the organ and then cross the dark sanctuary to get to the door to go outside and get in my car. And I always had the feeling that if I didn't hurry and get out that door, God was going to say something to me. I had this sense of presence that wasn't like the place was haunted. It was just like something important happens in this space, and maybe I just better hurry up and get out the door. So I hate to think that people were running away, but it's so important, I think, for us to talk about how it is we listen for God and what it sounds like. And is it an out loud voice, or is it a message in your heart or your head? I had someone once in Bible study, an adult, say, God doesn't speak to people anymore like God spoke in the Bible. But for all we know, Eli didn't hear God's voice. That could have been an internal voice for Samuel as well. For all we know, we don't see burning bushes. Maybe somebody who's watching can tell us that they have seen one. But it happens in all kinds of ways. Most reliably, how does it happen to you?
I think a feeling, but I have had these experiences where I have memories, song lyrics very often, which I think are distractions or earworms. When I pay attention to them, I'll often find, there's a message in that lyric that I get it, sort of situation. That happens a lot. But mainly but I have had some very incredible experiences where I just knew something in a time of prayer or meditation.
And there was clarity and there was peace always.
Yes, that's the thing.
That's for me the sign. That feeling of peace afterwards is a way that it's authentic, the way that I hold it up and go, I think that was instruction from God. So one of the reasons I love this story is because it reminds us to think about how it is those messages are received, who can be a helper to help us listen. And Samuel did exactly what Eli, his mentor, told him to do.
Well, you want to tell everybody what happened after that,
and then
since we didn't read it?
After that, when Samuel says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," God gives Samuel news that is terrible, crushing information about what is going to happen to Eli and his family. Just, you can't imagine a little boy going to Eli and telling Eli what God asked him to communicate. It's just an impossible message. I think if we stop at verse 10, it's a lovely story.
Right.
It's a lovely story of coming of age in terms of listening for God's voice. And then when we see what the assignment is, it's a reminder that we listen and sometimes we're given something that we really don't want to do.
Right. But once again,
which makes you want to run the next time you hear
right. Maybe I did make the right decision. But once again, Eli is mentor and says, you know what? God told you, so tell me what it is. And then so he shares the news with him and he says, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him.
So obedient, even when he knew.
Even when the news was bad.
But finally, the reckoning for the behavior of his sons was about to happen. Yes. Faithful through all of that, faithful guiding Samuel so that Samuel could be the man of God that he would be later in his life.
And that's a hard thing to pass the torch. Don't you think?
Very difficult thing. And I have a bad feeling about Eli because of how he treated Hannah. Remember that?
Oh, yeah. Didn't he accuse her of being drunk?
Yes. Mm-hmm. She was praying distraught because she was unable to bear a child. And he told her she shouldn't come for prayer drunk.
Yeah.
Bad pastoral care. Bad parenting.
Care. Mm-hmm.
But a good spiritual mentor.
Yeah. Very good.
Generous. One of those clay vessels that we hear about in the New Testament.
Yeah. Well, our chimes rang already. The time always flies with you, Renee. So thank you.
My pleasure.
And thanks for bringing this. I probably wouldn't have thought to do this story.
I love this story.
I do too. So I wonder what we'll talk about next week. We have to wait and see, won't we? Thanks for being here, and I hope you have a great week. Take care.